6th grade students, welcome back to our study on Africa. We are on page 325 in your book and 175 in your student activities manual, and we are going to be working through another way that anthropologists and other people who study humans, as well as historians, another way they divide Africa up in order to study it. Remember we talked about how big Africa is and how important it is to not just assume that everybody on the continent is the same. And there are different ways to divide up the continent of Africa to study it. And one of those ways is language groups. We talked in our other section about a little bit about how languages migrate. When people move, they take their language with them. You can kind of think about that here in America, how we use the word burrito, and how that's a Spanish word, and it actually comes from the word for donkey, burro, right? And so when the Spaniards came from Spain to Central and South America, they brought their language with them. And the language that they call Spanish in Mexico is a little bit different than the Spanish they speak in Honduras, and it's a little bit different than the Spanish they speak in Spain. And so languages, as people move, the languages move with them and then they change and morph, and so there are language families. It's kind of interesting, and if you're interested in reading more about it, I have some geography books that talk about language families. But anyway, in Africa, so let's talk about Northern Africa first. Northern Africa. More than the rest of the continent, Northern Africa was influenced by the rest of the world. And this is because Northern Africa, most of it, sits on the Mediterranean Sea, which is a really popular trading route. In addition to that, there's gold, there's copper, and there's ivory. And when you have things that are valuable, that's going to bring traders and merchants from other places in the world to where you live. There are cities, or were cities on the coast of North Africa, like Carthage, that were founded just for becoming trade outposts, and they were founded by other civilizations. The northern coast of Africa was highly influenced by Rome after the Punic Wars. Christianity got to Northern Africa in the first century, in the very first century. You know, as it's happening, there are people from Africa. We read in the book of Acts about the Ethiopian man who was taught the gospel, and so we know that Christianity came shortly after Jesus died with the spread of the gospel. In the north also, there were groups of nomads in the Sahara. And nomads, you will remember, are people who move from place to place. They don't stay in one spot. Most of these nomads belonged to a language group called the Berbers, B-E-R-B-E-R. There's actually a kind of carpet named after this, the Berbers. The biggest and most important, I guess, group of people who belonged to the Berber language were the Tuareg. Tuareg people. The Tuareg people, you can see a picture of a Tuareg woman and her baby on page 325. The Tuareg people dressed in these loose, kind of flowing clothing. They rode camels. They would wrap themselves up, and then the men would wrap themselves up with this long piece of cotton that worked for them like a turban and a veil. So they would wrap all of their heads up, so all that you would see would be their eyes. This was blue. It was dyed very dark blue. and sometimes the dye would get on people's skin. Have you ever worn a brand new pair of blue jeans that you haven't washed yet, and you take it off and you've got maybe some blue on you? Well, that happened to them, and because of that, they were actually known as the blue people, which is kind of funny because they weren't really blue, but this dye from the cotton that they wore. One of the reasons they would cover their skin so much is because it is so hot. You know, normally in America, we think if it's hot, we take off clothes, right? We wear shorts, we wear short sleeves. It's not so in the Middle East. They often wear head to toe coverings of very loose, light fabrics, which helps keep them cool. The Tuareg were farmers and herders, and they were traders. They were the ones that knew the best way to get across the Sahara. And so they were the ones that people would generally have as guides. They were also very skilled warriors. Tuareg bands would attack caravans and attack towns built on the edges of the desert. So these were not people that you didn't take seriously. They were very fierce people. The camel was their most valuable possession, for sure. Camels were introduced to northern Africa sometime around the birth of Christ. So right around 012. There's not a year 0, but you know what I mean. 1 BC, 2 BC, you know, it's around there. Camels are not pets. They're often described as ill-tempered. They spit. They're stubborn. But camels are a necessity even today in the desert because of their ability to go long distances without water. Horses and cattle could not survive for very long, for very far away from an oasis. Camels could, and so they became very, very valuable. In fact, they are known as the ships of the desert. They used camel hides to make tents, and they used camel milk to make butter and cheese. Tuareg people still live in Africa. They live in Algeria, Mali, Niger, Mauritania, Burkina Faso, and Libya. So there are still groups of Tuareg people. In fact, you can see the photographs on 325 and on the top of 326. And those are modern photographs. These are people that still live today, this group. In Central Africa, so now we're moving down a little bit, in the savannah and in the forests that are south of the Sahara, there were lots of people, lots of groups of people who were fairly prosperous. The soil was very fertile, and so there were farmers there. They built cities, they traded across the Sahara and across the Mediterranean, and there were some great empires that were formed in this area, and we're going to talk actually a little bit later about some of those great empires. This is the area that European missionaries first traveled with the gospel. Now, of course, like I said, we know from the book of Acts that the gospel came to Africa long before Europeans came to Africa, because the Ethiopian took the gospel down to his people. But later on, this is where European missionaries would come. The Nilotic language group, and I am not as familiar with these African languages, and I have heard some, and I'm going to, well, I'll get to that. So I hope you'll pardon me if I pronounce something incorrectly. The Nilotic language group lived in what is now the country of South Sudan, so the modern day country of South Sudan. And if you want to look at a map of modern day Africa, there's one on 321, and you can see South Sudan right next to Ethiopia. Okay. this is a language group. So you've got different tribes, but they all speak dialects of this language group. So South Sudan, Lake Victoria, obviously back then it wasn't called Lake Victoria, but the lake now known as Lake Victoria. The countries that are now known as Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. Of all of these different groups of people that are part of the Nilotic language group, the Maasai are probably the best well known. The best well known. The best known or the most well known. There we go. Maasai. The Maasai people were herders. They measured their wealth in animals, their social standing in animals. The more animals you own, the richer you were. Maasai warriors had to go through certain ceremonies to prove their manhood. So that would be something interesting to research about, gentlemen. What young Maasai warriors would have to do. Paint their skin red, go live in the wilderness to learn about survival. They were required to, the young men had to build a village and live in it for a specific period of time, and they had to kill a lion using only a spear. I would love to hear back from some of you if you happen to do any more research on this, of exactly what that looked like, that process. See what you can find about it. Because cattle were so important to the Maasai, if you were a Maasai man, you could get yourself a bride by offering cattle to her parents. Many Maasai men would have more than one wife. Polygamy was common. Maasai women, of course, stayed at home, took care of their children, and did all of the things that typically women would do back then. What's interesting about the Maasai women, though, is they were the ones that were in charge of not just taking care of their homes, but building them as well. Tree branches and grass, and of course they would take care of the animals that were there, cows, fetching water, that kind of thing. In the modern day country of Kenya, Maasai people still live. In fact, you can see on the bottom of 326 and then on the top of 327, you can see pictures of Maasai people. Now, the government of Kenya has ended the practice of killing lions. You can't do that anymore. But a lot of their traditions remain the same, and they live in ways that are very similar in many ways to the ways that their ancestors lived. It's really kind of interesting. Southern Africa. Now, guys, I just want to remind you one more time. We have crossed thousands of miles in 2 minutes. This is a big country, and there's so much more to learn about Africa. I have some books, not many, but I do have a few books about Africa, and you're certainly welcome to come up and check them out, or check them out next year if you're really interested in it, and we can look and see what else we can find. Because this is really fascinating to me, and it's a gap in my knowledge that I don't know a lot about. But this is a huge, huge continent, and we're just barely scratching the surface. Southern Africa. Most of Africa, well, not most, but a lot of Africa, was settled by the Bantu people. The Bantu people migrated around from the Benue River. They went east, they went south, and they finally settled in the Congo River Basin. Around 200 years they lived there. They prospered, their numbers grew, it was a good time. The land couldn't support any more villages, though. It gets to the point where there are too many people and you've got to move. So some of them left, went southeast more. They went all the way down to the southern tip of Africa. The Bantu were not the only ones living in the area that were just south of the Sahara. There was a group called the Pygmies, and we actually use the word pygmy now to mean small, and the reason is because this group of people called the Pygmies were very small people. They were short, and so now we use it, to describe anything that's a little bit smaller than the average. But the Pygmies lived in the rainforest of the Congo, so they lived way in the rainforest. The Bushmen and the Khoi Khoi lived there two. So the Pygmy tribes lived in the Congo River Basin rainforest, sorry. And then we've got the Bushmen and the Khoi. And the Bushmen and the Khoi and the Pygmies lost their groups, lost their land to the Bantu. They moved to the south, they moved to the west, and so they took their languages with them. The Bushmen and the Khoi speak languages that include clicks. So their languages are known as click languages. If you think about all the different noises that you can make with your mouth, in click languages, some of those clicks and different noises that you can make with your mouth have meaning in these languages. Click languages are fascinating to me. I enjoy a good beatboxer in an a cappella group, and many of them make these noises with their mouths that just blow my mind. But I am going to send out some links to some videos about click languages, because I think they're really fascinating. I love words, and it's really interesting to me to listen to the people who speak these languages talk, because in a lot of it, they sound like what we think of when we think of languages, and then you hear them click literally in the middle of a word, and then they keep going, and it's really fascinating to me. And so I will send those out in an email, and I hope that you will find them as interesting as I did. And we're going to wrap up there, and then next week we are going to talk about I forgot to say, in one more thing, and this isn't in your organizer, which is why I forgot to talk about it. In the middle of the 1600s, groups of Europeans found out how wealthy Africa was, and they decided they wanted to, come conquer it. And the Dutch were one of those groups of people, and down on the southern tip of Africa, they set up a city and then a nation. And the Dutch and then the people from England that joined them later. And so there is a language that's spoken in South Africa that is a kind of a mixture of Dutch and English and some African dialects, and it's called Afrikaans. This is not in your organizer, and so I forgot to mention it, but I did want to mention that. It's really interesting to hear someone speak Afrikaans as well. Next week we're going to be talking about some of the great African empires, the Aksum, the Ghana, the Songhai, and the Mali, and how those empires rose and fell and influenced Africa today.